So it's the third week in January, and I want to provide an update on what's happening in foreclosures across the state of Florida, and particularly here in the West Central Florida area, Tampa, Sarasota, Pinellas County. Last night, however, I watched the documentary on PBS on Frontline, The Untouchables, How Wall Street Executives Escaped Prosecution. And this is an absolute must-see for everyone who cares about this country, and particularly all of you who are involved in the space of foreclosure and financial crimes. What this documentary reports is once again how Wall Street and the banking executives that brought not just the economy in the United States of America to the edge of epic collapse, but the entire world's economy to the edge of epic collapse. And the thing that's so compelling about it is we have interviews there with the top law enforcement and government officials at the federal level, and these interviews demonstrate with absolute clarity how government got into bed with the banks and institutions which engaged in crimes and reckless behavior, brought this country to the edge of economic collapse, and the only reason why we survived this potential economic collapse is because the federal government stepped in and shoveled trillions of dollars worth of cash to these banks and institutions who got into the trouble they got into because of engaging in grossly criminal behavior. We're talking about fraud. We're talking about forgery. We're talking about lies all across the spectrum. The mortgage originators that sucked down trillions of dollars all across this country and along the way pocketed billions of dollars for themselves were engaging in such reckless conduct that was known to them at the time. And then that's where the criminality is absolutely clear. They were engaging in fraud and lies and crimes, both at the organic level, down here at the street, originating loans that they should not have, and then at every successive step in the chain, there was more fraud. There were more crimes that were engaged in because they were in fact committing fraud in and among themselves as they would sell these pools of loans to one another, knowing full well that they were fraudulent. And then once they were bundled and packaged, those loans were again sold to institutional investors, private investors. It may be your pension, Your Honor. It may be your pension, the sheriff and the deputy that's in that courtroom. And that's something that we have not yet forced all of this environment in our community to come to grips with. We are still battling the homeowners who are the victims of all of this behavior at this point in time. And then this grand Ponzi scheme, those victims who are higher up in the chain have not yet suffered the consequence. But the reality is that's what's happening here. Because, you see, while, again, foreclosure homeowners are the victims of this right now, the ultimate victims are going to be those who invested in these pools of loans. And if you look here in the state of Florida, the state's retirement system is heavily invested in mortgage-backed securities. That retirement system is populated by our state's judges and our law enforcement, our deputy sheriffs, and the people who work in courtrooms. And so it's sort of inconsistent that they would take such a bank-friendly approach to foreclosures, knowing, well, the problem is they don't know at this point in time, but they probably wouldn't take such a bank-friendly position on foreclosures if they understood that eventually they are the ones that are going to be paying the ultimate price for all the criminality and fraud. But again, focusing back on that Frontline documentary, what you see here is interviews with the federal government's chief enforcement officers for penalty and prosecution of crimes, talking specifically about Lanny Brewer, who in the Department of Justice is responsible for meting out justice. But the thing that I found most compelling about the interview, in talking and listening to these interviews with Lanny Brewer, is you have this law enforcement officer who is asserting that it's not his job to protect you and I as citizens. It's not his job to enforce existing laws and to punish crimes. It is his job to think about the larger consequences, the systemic consequences of prosecuting this bad behavior. And what we find across the board is that in a case like HSBC Bank, where HSBC Bank was found to have engaged in money laundering for drug cartels and money laundering for terrorist states, including Iran, when these facts were proven out beyond a doubt, the Department of Justice, rather than meting out any real penalty at all, decides not to prosecute them. Now, HSBC is just one of the most recent glaring examples of it. But at every level in all of these institutions, there are dramatic examples of that, from Bear Stearns, who are lying both to their individual clients and to regulators and to institutional investors, and of course to all the banks and institutions, again, who are lying not just to their own customers and their institutional investors, but also to regulators along the way. And then again, these regulators, rather than holding them accountable, in fact, helped them along the way. Another revelation that came out last week, which of course was not covered by any of the mainstream press, was the accusation again surfacing that Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, and then working with Timothy Geithner, but specifically focusing on Timothy Geithner. We understand that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation which is charged with creating money, actually handing money out to the banks and institutions so that it makes its way and trickles down to you and I, the consumer and citizen down on the street. But what we find is that in 2007, and then going into 2008, but specifically in 2007, when it became clear that all the lies and the fraud and the criminal conduct that the banks and institutions were engaging in at the institutional level was going to, in fact, crater and tank the economy. Those signs were dramatic. Those signs were absolute and explicit. And so those people who were involved in making bets on the state of the economy, particularly institutional investors, but then down street level investors, who were making bets on whether the economy was going to go up or whether it was going to go down, and accordingly whether they should make their money placed on shorts or based on longs. Those folks who read all of the symbols and looked at what happened around and recognized that the economy was going to crash and there was going to be major problems coming out of the Federal Reserve, clearly and correctly put their money on the short, that it was going down. But what happened was the Federal Reserve, against all logic, stepped in and provided some additional juice into the system. And in so doing, they created this down that the intelligent people had voted on, and in fact created an artificial high. This artificial high that they created benefited all of the institutional players. And curiously, the institutional players saw that play and made their bets on this side of the fence. Well, what was revealed was that Timothy Geithner telegraphed, or specifically told the banks and institutions what the Federal Reserve was going to do. And in fact, they were going to juice up the basis point to allow the banks and institutions to remain solvent, in fact, grossly profitable at a time when they should have taken a hit. Well, you have now a government official, Timothy Geithner, allegedly providing this inside information to the banks and institutions who likewise were able to profit from that, while on the other side of this equation, all of the smaller players were lost, and some people lost their entire fortunes, and so they just crashed. So again, that's a perfect example of the government directly involved with the institutional players. We talk repeatedly about fascism. That's a classic example of that, of how the government melding together with these corporate interests, benefiting the corporate interests at the expense of the population and the general public. Now, what does this do for us today here in 2013? There's a dramatic and scary situation that's happening out here. There has been a very marked increase in foreclosure activity in the courtrooms here at the local level. You know, I've been highly critical, as have most reporters in the alternative press, or anybody that's out there thinking. I say most reporters in the alternative press because nobody in the mainstream press has been as critical of the settlements, the 49 state AG, the Office of Comptroller and Currency, or these other settlements. But nobody in the mainstream press has been appropriately critical of these agreements. You'll remember that we caught them in the mainstream press, reporting the press releases that were provided by the banks and institutions working through the 49 state AG and those settlement terms. But rather than critically analyzing these settlement agreements and considering what the real impact was going to be to foreclosures, the mainstream press was reporting these dramatic numbers, $25 billion settlement or $10 billion settlement in the OCC and these other things. But those of us out here in the real press, in the blogosphere, who actually looked at them and read the agreements, recognized that it absolutely was not going to be those numbers, and that the banks, in fact, had gotten off with yet another sweetheart deal. But one thing that wasn't reported at any of these press conferences, and one thing that none of the government officials that are supposed to represent the interests of the voters and the consumers in the states that they represent, the federal officials representing consumers. What was not reported on was the fact that a consequence of these settlements was going to be a dramatically increased foreclosure environment and a much tougher environment across the country. And in fact, now that is occurring all across the state. And this is where it's really dangerous for consumers. You see, I've been one of the proponents of pro se people defending themselves. If you can't hire an attorney, file pleadings on your own behalf, go in there and protect your home, serve your family. That's worked well for many people for a number of years, but now we're reaching a critical juncture where the banks are moving forward, the judges here at the state level are allowing them to move forward, and foreclosure sales are being set, foreclosure trials are being held. And those consumers who have been living in their home now for years in a false sense of security with pleadings or motions that they filed are very much going to be caught with this. And we're seeing it, and it's quite disturbing. In courtrooms, with consumers who've gotten away with filing their pleadings and their motions are now being just rolled over. And so we're in a real critical juncture right now. If you're involved in foreclosure litigation as a pro se litigant, the time for pro se advocacy is over. Now you have to get experienced foreclosure practitioners to get in there and represent yourself, or represent you. And frankly, if you do not, you are going to lose. You are not going to walk into a foreclosure trial and have any success because the deck is frankly so dramatically stacked against you. And word should be spoken about appellate advocacy for pro se folks. I hear people calling and talking about their desire to appeal their individual cases because they feel like they've been wronged at the trial court level. And the fact of the matter is they may very well have been wronged. You may not have gotten a fair shake in a trial courtroom. But a pro se litigant filing an appellate opinion and taking an appeals case is an absolute nightmare and should not be done under any circumstances, because almost invariably a pro se litigant filing an appeal is going to result in an unfavorable decision that's going to be bad not just for that homeowner but for everyone in the community that's out there fighting. So if you as a pro se litigant are considering filing an appeal, you need to consider not just the negative consequence that's going to have on you and your individual case, but you need to consider what's going to happen to everyone in this community that's out there fighting together. Like we've seen in many of the decisions here in Florida, the appellate court uses those pro se appeals as an opportunity to write very unfavorable opinions. And so again, that word of warning is don't do it. You just shouldn't file those appeals. What you should do is reach out to experienced practitioners in your community, licensed members of the bar that practice in front of the courtrooms in which your case is filed. I can't stress that enough, because we still have this phenomenon out there where consumers, people who are involved in foreclosure, are being victimized by out-of-state loan mitigation or loan audit companies, and maybe even organizations that assert to be lawyers and assert that they can represent individuals in courtrooms. You cannot. What you need are local practitioners who are able to go into courtrooms and use a lot of the information that we've developed over the last couple of years to at least give you a fighting shot in a trial of a favorable outcome. So with that in mind, keep up the fight, but recognize now that if you're a consumer out there fighting and you're going to continue alone in these very critical phases, you're going to lose, and that's an outcome that we all can't put up with.